Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today on the program, we are joined by Scott Ritter, a former U.S. Marine major, and also a United Nations weapon inspector. So, welcome back to the program.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, I think yeah, everyone's been curious where Trump is going to go with this presidency because he himself recognized that in the first administration there were too many neocons who sabotaged what he wanted to do. At least that's what he says, and he was going to put America first this time, which is what he said. But I would say that it also seems that he has some genuine desires to end different wars, including the war against Russia. But now, of course, he brings together both the America First, but also the neocons. I'm never sure if this is to play the good cop, bad cop, or if it's just doesn't have control over his administration. But do you see the neocons then having pulled in Trump?
I don't see the neocons having pulled in Trump. I see the neocons. Look, when Trump won this election, he made it clear that he was going to try to improve on mistakes he had made in the past. I think he understood the role played by Mike Pompeo and John Bolton in undermining the national security objectives and priorities that he had laid out, and that he lacked the experience and he lacked um, the assistance of people he could trust. And one of the reasons was that the political reality of Washington, D.C. is such that the bench upon which you select your cabinet members is actually not very big. And in order to get on that bench to begin with, you have to have experiences that are linked to decades of American national security policy where the neoconservatives have dominated. So in order to become relevant, to be relevant, you had to be willing to play that game and march to the beat of their drum. So Trump still needs to rely on that bench. He can't, there's not a sufficient pool of manpower available to him where he could staff the totality of his cabinet and senior positions with people who didn't come from the establishment. And the other thing is that the likelihood of Congress or the Senate, allowing Trump to just come in with a clean slate. The Senate is in itself an embodiment of the deep state. These senators are elected for 6-year terms. Many of them have served multiple terms in office. They have been in Washington, D.C. They help define the power establishment. And so they need allies within the administration. So there's a political game being played where Trump has to appoint, a certain number of people in order to give his cabinet the balance necessary for the Senate to allow him to move forward. And so that's what I see has happened here. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is a classic, neocon, deep state pick. Anybody who believes that he's loyal to Donald Trump doesn't know little Marco. The two men hate each other, but it's political necessity on both parties, and I believe that this appointment was brokered by Miriam Adelson, who gave Trump a lot of money and said they wanted Rubio, and I think Rubio was talked to and told that you're going to have to play the game for a little while. But he's not going to play the game in a way that undermines his credibility and his viability going forward. Little Marco still wants to be president of the United States one day. He's young enough, and now he has a platform to promote, his name. And so he will, fight against Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, Trump is still calling the shots, not little Marco, and not anybody else. Keith Kellogg's not calling the shots. Scott Bessent isn't calling the shots. Donald Trump is calling the shots. He's far more assertive this term than he was during his first term.
Yeah, that is true. But I often think about this one interview you've probably seen with Putin where he sits down, because of his 25 years as a president, he's seen all this president come and go. And he said that a lot of them come with a genuine ambition to change. But then, as he said, the people come in dark suits and tell the new president how it really is, and it changes. And it reminds me a bit about what Milton Friedman called the tyranny of the status quo. That is, if you want to have a real change in government, you have to do it within the first few weeks. Otherwise, you get captured by the permanent bureaucracy, or the deep state, as it's also called. But in terms of the peace negotiations between the United States and Russia, as yeah, I guess the two largest participants in this conflict. Do you think Trump understands the concerns of the Russians? Because yeah, when again, it's very hard to read the Trump.
Uh, yeah, first of all, let's start off with that reality. It's very hard to read Trump. So anybody who thinks that they have the perfect insight, I mean, it's always dangerous doing these interviews like this because you ask a very good question, but
Well,
it requires me to commit to an answer that
I,
then is subjected to very close scrutiny over the course of time. And normally, when I answer a question like this, it's my answer is based upon experience and patterns of behavior, predictable patterns of behavior, so that if I see a pattern, I can project that pattern into the future and say, I have good reason to believe that this is a probable course of action. With Donald Trump, there is no predictable pattern of behavior. So this is always risky. I'm going to answer the question. I just wanted to, say how difficult these kind of questions are about Donald Trump because we just don't know. Um, I think Trump fully understands the Russian position because he's had three conversations with Vladimir Putin, the most important of which was the last one, in which I think if we ever get the complete transcript, I think Vladimir Putin laid out in no uncertain terms what the Russian position is because you saw a modification of Trump's behavior in the aftermath of that phone call, um, where he made certain statements such as Russia will win this war. I mean, that's an assertion of fact that you don't normally hear come from the White House. I think Joe Biden was that Russia is losing this war and Russia will never be allowed to win this war, and Trump has said Russia will win this war. And I think the implication is no matter what we do, Russia is going to win this war. Um, and I also think that there's a sense of futility on his part, meaning it's futile to continue repeating the past practices of the past, the practices of the past, because they haven't worked. Sanctions, right now you have Congress getting ready to, go forward with sanctions. It won't work. I mean, these sanctions will require the United States to make um, decisions regarding the imposition of secondary sanctions against people we want to be our allies. India, we would expect India to stop buying Russian oil at a time when India has bought more Russian oil than they ever have before. Um, China, I don't think the Chinese would even entertain a phone call from the United States about behavioral modification when it comes to Russia. And so, Trump is looking at, a Congress that's trapped in, the past decades, and has to reflect upon Europe and, European decisions with the 17th tranche of sanctions have been passed, so pathetic that, normally Vladimir Putin is very controlled with his words, called them idiots. In a contest of idiots, they would take second place. I mean, good sense of humor, but language you don't normally get from the Russian president, but he's very frustrated with the stupidity of Europe. And Donald Trump, I think, recognizes the impotence of Europe, and also recognizes his strategic vision of disentanglement from Europe. So I think Trump gets it 100%. The problem is his team isn't on the same page. At the same time, when Trump is, making, assertions of, the inevitability of Russian victory, you have Marco Rubio testifying before the United States Congress saying that Russia won't be able to achieve its goals. Um, I mean, this is a disconnect. Does the Secretary of State make declaratory policy, or does the President of the United States? And whose voice should have more weight? This is the disconnect. You have Keith Kellogg, who's literally off in la la land with the things that he's talking about, totally disconnected from the policy direction that Donald Trump appears to have taken. Even J.D. Vance is, you know, offbeat, saying things, at a time, at least Marco Rubio, when cornered by Congress, I think it was Bill Keating, asked him, is President Putin a war criminal? Understood that you can't answer that question, no matter how you feel, because of the need to um, keep the potential of dialogue and discussion open. But J.D. Vance is giving a speech at one of the military academies where he says that Russia is our enemy and that we have to prepare to go to war and fight them. Um, Not really the speech that should be given right about now. If your policy direction is that of peace, there's a lot of confusion in the Trump administration. And a lot of the confusion comes from the fact that Donald Trump himself seems to be, altering direction every other week. Who knows what he's going to say? And one of the big unknowns, one of the reasons why it's so difficult to forecast Trump, is that a lot of what drives him is ego, and how his ego is being massaged at a particular time, a given day, and a given week. Vladimir Putin had a 2-hour phone call that made Donald Trump feel pretty darn good. But the the benefits of that massage quickly dissipate over time, and now we have different people whispering in Trump's ears. And will he? He doesn't have the foundation of fact-based knowledge about Russia that is needed to sustain a position over time. And so he is now a victim to, that which is whispered in his ear. And I'm afraid that, this time next week, somebody will be able to whisper something in his ear that gets him to say something completely different. And you see the Russians, they appear not to care. I mean, I'm sure you'll ask about this, but between Lavrov and Putin and Medinsky and the whole crew, Russia's all in for the strategic defeat of Ukraine. There's no room for Russia to yield on any of the issues that Europe and the United States would like them to yield on to create this potential of compromise. I don't think there's any compromise in Russia. I think this is going to finish with Ukraine being compelled to accept unconditional terms of surrender.
Yeah, I picked up on that. Rubio being confronted with this. Do you condemn the war crimes? It's interesting. It fits very well in with the European war propaganda model we have as well, because they start off with the moral position that don't you find it morally questionable, or wouldn't you condemn this? And of course, if you don't condemn it, you're a horrible person, and you're finished, so you're not relevant anymore. And if you do recognize it, which is required to be relevant, then you locked yourself in, because if you're essentially buying into the narrative that we're fighting Hitler, then we can't anymore have any compromise. We can't have any talks. There's no dialogue to be had, no diplomacy, and the only path forward is then war, more weapons. And this is how we ended up essentially banning political dissent across Europe. But because it looks like Trump has at least 2 occasions that NATO expansion provoked the Russian invasion. Yeah. Which is important, because you have to recognize the concern of the other guy if you actually want to alleviate this security concern and find peace. And he also recognized that the Russians are, as I said, winning the war, and they're holding all the cards. So, and if he then understands also that Russia has some security demands which are non-negotiable, such as not having the NATO soldiers in Ukraine, such as the proposal by Keith Kellogg, as you described as La La Land. What is the path forward then? If the Ukrainians and the Europeans refuse to even, I mean, it's not even that they don't want to. At least the Ukrainians talking now. The Europeans, still don't want to even pick up their phone. So when America says it will either need a negotiated settlement now or walk away, is this already a done deal that they will walk away, or do you think they can pressure the Europeans to start to see the world as it is?
Well, let's understand that walking away will hurt Europe more than it will hurt Russia. That Trump's walking away isn't that he's walking away from Russia into the arms of Europe, where he will, double down on NATO's viability, increase the number of American forces deployed, supply endless, tranches of weaponry to Ukraine to empower them to somehow defeat the Russian threat. Walking away means he just simply walks away and leaves Russia to its own devices. But I think that there's a different strategy. I do think at the end of the day, the United States will walk away, but they may actually walk toward Russia. We have the Russians are the instigators of the 1,000 to 1,000 trade. They're the ones who put that on the table. So in the mind of Donald Trump, it's the Russians that pushed for this, and they get points. I think either Medinsky or Lavrov recently said that as soon as this prisoner trade is done, Russia will provide in writing the blueprint for a negotiated settlement, which is one of their obligations under the Istanbul II discussions. So Russia will be checking off all the boxes it needs to check off to be seen as being compliant, which is what Putin said. And so Trump's ego will say, I talked to Putin, we made these agreements, and the Russians are living up to their end of the agreement. The problem will come with Ukraine. I mean, one of the interesting things that came out of this Istanbul II is the conversation, I think it was reported by Medinsky, that he had with Yermak about where Yermak said, you guys got it far easier than we do because you only have one boss. We have three. A stunning acknowledgement by the head of or one of the senior members of the Ukrainian delegation that Ukraine is not a sovereign state, that Ukraine has no sovereignty.
Sorry, was this comment made public? I didn't catch it.
My wife, who is a fluent Russian speaker and follows the Russian press, hit me with this morning, and she normally wouldn't commit to something unless she triple check. So I will do my. Fact is,
I wasn't questioning. I was
fascinating. No,
I
know. When we talk, my mind goes to answering questions, and so I would have preferred to do this, but while we're talking, I am going to ask her for the source of Medinsky.
Well, I've heard similar comments coming from others, such as the former advisor of Zelensky, Arostovich. He made it point before that the countries who didn't let us have peace, in the first Istanbul, still won't let us have peace today. So yeah.
But he wasn't at the negotiation. This is a senior negotiator of the Ukrainian side acknowledging to the Russians, we have no sovereignty. And that means that there won't be any peace. I think that's the reason why there won't be a peace plan is because Ukraine doesn't represent itself. And there are other interests. Remember, the European interest in Ukraine isn't a free and sovereign democratic Ukraine. It's to use Ukraine as a proxy to defeat Russia. And that was also the American goal and objective. So nobody cares about Ukraine. Nobody. Not even the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians can't speak for a single voice. This is why a peace process is doomed, because to have peace, both sides have to be interested in peace. Ukraine is not interested in peace. Not at all. No one has articulated anything in Ukraine that remotely resembles reality when it comes to bringing it into this conflict. Ukraine lives in a fantasy land, whether it's a drug-induced fantasy land in Bankova Street in the mind of the president, or ideologically driven fantasy in the minds of the nationalists that he surrounded himself with. The bottom line is there's no reality from a policy perspective coming out of Kiev. And as long as that's the case, then Russia has no choice but to continue to press forward. And from what I'm seeing, every day the situation just gets much worse for the Ukrainians on the battlefield. And now Russia has made a decision, Vladimir Putin, that in addition to the threats made about the four oblasts, Odessa, Nikolaev, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkov, becoming part of Novorossiya, Putin has said, yeah, we're going to take 3 additional oblasts, maybe not to incorporate them, but they will become a buffer zone. And so Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkov now are on the block for different purposes. Ukraine's shrinking as we speak. And the one thing about the Russians, they don't commit. Vladimir Putin doesn't commit to something, then walk away from it. So, this commitment is not, I don't believe, a negotiating ploy where he puts something on the table only to withdraw it when a counteroffer is out there. This commitment was made because there is no viable negotiating partner in Ukraine, because Ukraine doesn't speak with a single voice. And so this is Vladimir Putin doing what is necessary for Russia to achieve the terms that it demands for peace. And one of the terms is that Ukraine will never again be allowed to put at risk the territory or the people of Belgorod and Kursk.
Yeah, you sound a bit almost word by word like the Arestovich there. He makes the same point as well, that the state more or less has captured, and some of the rationality is now absent. Also focusing on the failure to actually make a peace, because they're in a horrible position at the moment. As you said, of course, the front line's been crumbling a bit for a while, but only on the last few days, what's happening? It's this idea that the front lines can be as stable as they were in the past. I think this is gone, and but it still begs the question of what do you see if the Americans walk away and the Europeans still refuse to pick up a phone, and Ukrainians don't come together with a common position. How does this play out? Because you say they will get an unconditional surrender. What will Russia demand or take in such a surrender in terms of territory? Do you think they will go for annexing some more regions, or simply doing some buffer zones? What do you think? Well, if the Russians could get anything they want, what would they want? What would they demand? Because in Europe, people are convinced that Russia would take all of Ukraine, but again, this is a bit la-la land as well. But what would they take?
I firmly believe that if Russia could write the script, that Russia would have had Crimea, a land bridge to the Donbass, and that's it. And they didn't even want the land bridge. They were willing to give that land bridge away. What Russia wants is a stable Ukraine. What Russia wants is a Ukraine that is not hostile to Russia, that doesn't operate in opposition to Russian interests. A new government, that's what Russia wants. The absorption of territories is not something that comes free of cost. The conversion of Kherson and Zaporizhia. I spoke to the governor of Kherson, and it is not just that you have to deal with the consequences of war, but you are converting Ukrainian oblast that has been subjected to deterioration while Russia was emerging from the nightmare of the 1990s and improving its quality of life. Ukraine was deteriorating, especially in the peripheral oblasts where you had a Russian language dominated population. They were not a priority in terms of investments, infrastructure investments, etc. So, the Russians saw this when they took over Crimea in 2014, the horrific damage that had been done to the infrastructure of Crimea, that Russia's now been compelled to spend billions of dollars to fix, and they're still working on it. That exists in Kherson, that exists in Zaporizhia, that of course exists in Donetsk and Lugansk. All of these four oblasts have to be brought up to Russian national standards, and this is very expensive. So the idea now of absorbing, Odessa, absorbing Dnipropetrovsk, absorbing Kharkov and Nikolaev, yes, you get to draw a nice little line on the map, but you're now you own that, which means you got to bring it up. That's a big expense, an unbudgeted expense. It's there's no budget in place for the billions of dollars needed to bring these territories up to Russian standards. So I don't think Russia wants that. I don't think Vladimir Putin wants that. He looks at the Russian reality and says, we're doing okay. We have an economy that's functioning, that's growing. But the last thing we need to do is sink it by bringing in these unfunded mandates that are brought out. So they will, they will only take these four oblasts if driven to that decision point by, the realities of national security. And I think that's what's going to happen. I do think they're going to take Odessa, Nikolaev, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkov. And I do think that the mechanism of absorbing these will be through referendum that are carefully controlled by the Russian Federation. I do believe that there will be a new government put in play. You saw, if the rumors are correct, this former advisor to Viktor Yanukovych, who lives in Spain, was in Kiev in May, I forget in May 14th through 19th or something of that nature, having meetings with senior Ukrainian officials, including, some rumors say, Zelensky. And these meetings were at the behest of the Russian government, saying this is what needs to happen in terms of the transition away from a Zelensky government to a government acceptable to Russia, not only to bring about the end of the conflict, but to rule Ukraine in a post-conflict environment. It won't be this government. It will be something different, because that's part and parcel of the process of denazification, is to eliminate these nationalists and to rewrite the Ukrainian constitution in a way that's favorable to Russia, that meets the Russian demands. This guy was killed because of it. But the Russians, I've spoken to former prime ministers of Ukraine that are now in Russia. I've spoken to other officials. They are looking to a post-conflict reality where Russia is in control in Kiev. And that's a necessity. Now, is that sufficient? If Ukraine wants to fight to the death, Russia's already said, in addition to the four oblasts that I believe will now be occupied by Russia and subjected to eventual referenda for joining Russia. Kharkov is one of those, but now we have Sumy and Chernihiv that are going to be buffer zones. I don't know if there'll be buffer zones in their totality or 150 kilometers from the border, but we're talking about significant swaths of territory. Will Russia seek to incorporate these territories as well, or just use them as a demilitarized zone, and eventually return them to Ukraine? One of the things that haunts Russia is post-conflict stability in Ukraine, because it's not Russia's interest to have this cancerous tumor existing on its border. Ukraine is a large nation, still large if they lose the oblast. It's who's going to rebuild it? How's it going to function economically? By absorbing Odessa, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, you're taking away vital industries. You're taking away access to the Black Sea, literally strangling Ukraine to death. This is problematic for the Russians. It's another reason why the Russians may not, have been so keen on forcing the Odessa issue. But now Ukraine has given them no choice. And so we're coming to what I've spoken in the past, what I call the Odessa moment, which is that period in time in the conflict where Russia will make a pause and give the Ukrainians a chance to end the conflict based on present reality. And if Ukraine refuses, then Russia makes the commitment to Odessa. And I think we are at the Odessa moment. But now the question is, what's next after that? And I call it the Lvov moment, where Russia will have to make a decision. They're not going to absorb Lvov or Western Ukraine, but if you get in a situation where you have a Russian-oriented government in Kiev that's not, and let's talk about a government in exile that forms up in Lvov, that government in exile cannot be allowed to exist. And as part of denazification, Russia will have to physically occupy Lvov and begin the process of the physical extermination of whatever they define as Nazi elements. I think Russia would prefer not to do that. It's a very risky move, but Russia's not walking away from this conflict, leaving situations unresolved. They've said that their goal is to get to the root causes of this conflict so that when this conflict ends, there will never be another conflict. And that can't happen as long as Lvov is in the hands of Western Ukrainian nationalists who seek confrontation with Russia.
Yeah, I heard talk of this as well from Russia, the idea that now that it becomes very evident that they will win the war, that there's also need to win the peace. That is, which presents a dilemma, because if some of this more of these territories were under Russian control, I guess the benefit for the Russians, they would have this clear buffer. Also, they would prevent a lot of territories from being used by hostile powers in the future, using Ukraine as a proxy, that is. On the other hand, if they take too much and I guess destroys too much of the infrastructure, if Ukraine becomes a basket case, it's not going to be great for stability on Russian borders either. And it will also, I guess, makes relations with Europe even more unstable as well. But yeah, it's a very hard dilemma to solve. My last question was more on the how you see the. I guess you mentioned before the moral question being put to Rubio as it looks like Trump understands the basics. The war's being lost, the Russians hold the card, but at the same time, as we all see in Europe, the moral question always comes in. That is, it's said that these territories of Ukraine, that it's not just that Russia gets them because it's Russian. It will disrupt international law, so some of it, based on the legal issue. But I think it was Rubio who said that, Russia they're not entitled to any of this. It's not theirs to put claims to. And, once countries start to talk about justice, they tend to often lock themselves into positions, irrespective of the realities on the ground. The problem, obviously, is always that justice is, very subjective. If, say, it's not just for Russia to annex Donetsk city, you can say, well, it's not just for Kiev, but for the people in Donetsk who might not want to live in Ukraine anymore. It might be just. So again, just depends on, from whose perspective. But that being said, do you see this new language being used a bit by Marco Rubio and others in the government may again lead to a more aggressive policy now towards, or at least less accommodating?
There is that risk. I mean, because look, there's an obvious retort, but I don't see anybody in the United States who's politically viable having the courage to say that. But I'd be more than happy to come to any European capital and stare their leaders in the eyes and hit them with, the following challenges. Was it just to dismember Germany in a post-World War II environment, giving Silesia to Poland and dividing Poland up, giving Eastern Poland into the Soviet Union? Was this just, or was it necessary for regional stability and security? Was it just for the United States and Europe to support the Croatians to carry out a policy of ethnic cleansing to drive Serbians out of Croatia so that you had a more ethnically homogenous Croatia in a post-conflict reality? Just, or reality? And when we speak about international law, no one's been able to contradict the Russians' articulation of Article 51 of the United Nations Charter in regard to the decision to go into initiate the special military operation. Collective self-defense is not just a principle that Russia invented on the spot, but a principle that was applied by NATO and the United States in justifying their intervention against Serbia and Kosovo. So the West literally has no grounds. Then I would confront Marco Rubio about his stance on the Golan Heights and why the United States allows Israel to annex the Golan Heights and feels that this is justified because it was the fruit of war, because continued possession of the Golan Heights by the Syrians represented an existential threat to Israel, and Israel had no choice but to do this. Then that same logic clearly applies to everything that Russia is doing. And the final thing is, Russia didn't start this conflict. And I will confront every single member of Europe Europe and every European government and the United States about the true history of their respective involvement in Ukraine. Uncomfortable history that they don't necessarily want us to get into. But I would like to know what their involvement was in the 2004-2005 color revolution in Kiev, because that didn't happen by itself. I'd like to know about the European money that went in to facilitate the rise of Yushchenko and the Ukrainian nationalists. I'd like to know about the role of the CIA, which had a relationship with Ukrainian nationalists dating back to 1948 and continued nonstop until 1990, when it was transferred over to various non-governmental organizations funded by USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy. The German Marshall Fund. I'd like to get into every one of the funds that the Europeans operate on. The bottom line is this war is a war that Europe and the United States were looking for. Europe doesn't talk about the role they played in the training of Ukrainian forces from 2015 onward. What was the purpose of that training, Europe? What did you train them to do? At least the U.S. Army is honest enough to have put out a slide that says we train a battalion of Ukrainian forces every 55 days here in the West to go east to fight the Russians and liberate the Donbass. At least we were honest about that. Europe is incapable of being honest about what they were doing, but we know what their intention was, and we know what their intention is to this date. So for Europe to pretend or articulate in any way, shape, and form that this war was started by Russia, when Russia is the only party that has consistently sought an off-ramp from conflict, is absurd in the extreme and insulting. But as you said, the current political reality is such that nobody will survive politically, even if they speak truth to power. And right now, we don't have anybody in the United States capable of standing up to Marco Rubio during his congressional testimony. And there certainly isn't anybody who is politically viable at the moment who is willing to stand up to the European driven narrative that Russia is to blame for this conflict. Russia didn't start this war, but you know what? Russia's going to finish this war on their terms.
So yeah, just to finish, then you don't see a political settlement being possible. This will be ending with a Russian victory and a surrender on the Ukrainian side.
Yeah, and I also see that the Russians are, again, the only thing more dangerous than trying to forecast Donald Trump.
Sorry, I keep asking you for forecast. I apologize. It's always not a great.
It's putting myself in the shoes of the Russian government, which I can't do. I mean, I can't speak for them, but I will say this: having studied Russia, the Soviet Union, and while I can't claim expertise, I always hesitate to use that term. I can complain. I can't say competence in discussing matters pertaining to Russian foreign policy and national security policy. I think the Russians are looking at Europe right now as a region, Western Europe, as Europe in its totality, I guess, as a region in transition. And so normally when you make policy, you want known knowns, you want quantifiables. As Anatoly Antonov, the former ambassador of Russia to the United States, told me several times, predictability is one of the essential elements. It doesn't matter that the person is for you or against you. What matters most is predictability, so that you can create policy that's consistent over time. So I think when the Russians, when they're looking for predictability, the predictability trajectory of Europe is one of decline and one of growing impotence. So for Russia, for instance, to say we're going to predicate where we want to be in 2 years based upon declaratory policy of Europe today, where they speak of spending 800 billion euro on rebuilding the army and doing this, that, and the other thing. I mean, even the Germans, putting the 45th, armored brigade in Vilnius in Lithuania. I mean, you had to read carefully to realize they said it's a virtual brigade because it doesn't exist yet. It may come into power, into being 2027 or 2029 or 2030. We don't know if it ever will. It's a virtual brigade. It doesn't really exist. But this is the thing. All of Europe's power potential is virtual. You had Mark Rutte acknowledge that Russia is producing 4 times the amount of artillery ammunition than all of NATO combined, and that includes the United States. That's because the Russian defense industry is, mobilized far more efficiently than Europe, and Europe can't catch up. They're incapable of catching up. this is all wishful thinking on their part. The concept of harnessing their industrial potential and matching it with, the support of the people, because that's an important element that's missing. In fact, it is the fatal element in the European vision, because as we speak, we see forces of transition. I mean, yes, the European centrists were able to, I believe, manipulate the election in Romania to ensure that their person stayed in power. But how much longer is that going to be the case in Poland? We now have a runoff election on June 1st for the presidency, in which a Trump-like figure, a conservative historian, may in fact win out against Donald Tusk's, handpicked person for prime minister. In Portugal, was the Chigar party has surged now to have 58 seats in the parliament. And as we watch the Portuguese replicate the political failure of the rest of Europe, they can't keep a government in place. They had a socialist government elected in 2022. It fell, replaced by centrists in 2024, who collapsed under pressure from the socialists for this election today, where they've won, but they don't have a majority. But meanwhile, the right-wing party surges. In France, Marine Le Pen could play her party could be a very important factor in changing French politics. Keir Starmer is not a solid foundation of political stability. The AfD, the crisis that may arise if Germany feels compelled to ban them. So from a Russian perspective, you can't build policy based upon statements being made by a European entity that lacks any sort of political stability. And if you are projecting trajectories, the trajectories show that it's the charge of the right brigades, if you want to say so, the political right moving to harness political dominance in Europe. And if that's the case, then it's a safe bet for Russia to say that as long as they are balanced in their approach, that by the time Russia's ready to dictate terms of surrender to Ukraine, Europe will be in a position to accept the inevitability of that outcome, that the people today that are promoting a trajectory of confrontation with Russia will no longer be in political power and no longer have the ability to promote these policies, and they'll be replaced by other people who are more accepting of a Russian reality. Again, Russia has to play this carefully. Russia can't overplay its cards. First of all, Russia's not in a position to. We're talking about the inevitability of Russian victory, but it's still going to require Russia to very carefully manage its economic resources and manage its domestic political environment. Right now, Vladimir Putin benefits from a political environment that has 50 to 60,000 Russians volunteering every month to join the military. But, politics is fickle, and you make the wrong decision, you get a chain reaction of events that create, a negative environment inside Russia, and you could see that political support collapse. You could see the economy fall apart, and you have a different reality. So Russia has to manage this very, very carefully, and I see the Russians doing just that, which is why I don't think we're going to see dramatic, changes. I think we're going to see pressure. I do think the only point of drama will come, I think, with the military collapse of Ukraine. I do think that we're getting close to that point. But they've shown themselves to be surprisingly resilient, etc. The other thing that might be coming up is the political collapse of Zelensky. What will replace him, I don't know. But the Russians are betting on his political collapse and the creation of a vacuum that will enable them. Right now, they're insisting that there be, as part of the preconditions of peace, that there be elections in Ukraine. But again, I think the Russians are going to be very measured, but they're moving towards resolving the totality of the problem, which includes Lvov. And I think that they're going to time this with the degradation of centrist political control in Europe.
Well, you're certainly very correct about the resilience of the Ukrainians. I mean, even now there's a lot of cracks appearing. The Kupiansk looks like it's being caught in a pincer. You have this huge advancements going down in Zaporozhye region. Siversk might also come under, might fall, and after this you have the whole Slavyansk area as well. So after Konstantinivka as well. So there's a lot of things happening now, but so it feels like it's the collapse is intensifying a bit, but it's also, yeah, one shouldn't underestimate, I guess, the Ukrainians, because I thought that they would have, I thought they would have begun to fall apart already, but yeah, they're holding in there though. So
Well, I think it, one of the when we talk of the Lvov moment, one of the reasons why I bring that up too is and again, this is big brush analysis, so take it for what it is. But the population of Ukraine in 2022 was what, 44.8 million, something of that nature. And today, what we see is 3.5 million people, Eastern Ukrainians, have taken Russian passports in the newly constituted, republics or oblast districts of Russia: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk. Another 1.5 million Eastern Russians have fled to Russia. Between 6 and 8 million have fled to Europe and live in refugee status. And so the population of Ukraine is down to around 33 million. That from a political demographic standpoint, that means that whatever, when you looked at the totality of Ukraine in 2022, you could say that the political center of gravity was in Kiev. But now, with the dilution of the demographics, with the Eastern Ukrainians, the Russian speakers fleeing or taking Russian passports, the political center of gravity has shifted to Lvov. And these are hardliners. These are, in many cases, fanatics. And I think that contributes to the resilience, and that because Ukraine, in many ways, is redefining itself as a nation, a national entity. And so, whatever political dynamic existed in the past, it doesn't exist today. I think there's part of this resilience comes from the fact that we're dealing with genuine fanatics who will not accept surrender as an option, and many of whom are willing to die before they surrender.
and well, yeah, it was supposed to be my last question, but sorry. Do you think they will take Kiev? I mean, it seems like a bridge too far, but again, beyond power interest, it seems to have a very significant role in the whole national identity as, the mother of all Russian cities and all. Do you see this?
What I see happening is I see the collapse of the Zelensky government, and I see a Ukrainian government taking control that will do the bidding of Russia. So you don't need to physically take Kiev. What I see happening is that politically it'll become aligned, and that you won't have Russian troops occupying Kiev, but you'll have Kiev becoming, I think you'll see a change in the security apparatus, a change in. I don't think any streets will be named Stepan Bandera Boulevard anymore. And but I don't see Russia physically occupying Kiev. No, not. I don't see Russia taking Kiev like the Battle of Berlin. If Russia comes into Kiev, I see it to be sort of symbolic after a political change. But no, that I don't think there's going to be a Battle of Kiev.
Anyways, yeah, I had like 3, 4 last questions, so I will leave it there. Scott Ritter, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.